It's day 239. It's also December 31st, 2019. And we're in Fort Stockton, Texas. You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig, and this is my story. A story about life. Life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description. And the exploration of Texas continues. And, par for the course, for us, we didn't make it very far from Pecos when we found another piece of Texas history. Fort Stockton, complete with a few twists I hadn't seen coming. And the more I read and think I learn, the more I'm realizing history is a funny thing. I'm becoming more and more fascinated with how many different versions of history there are. This, in particular, came to light in learning of the Pecos area and reading about that guy named Billie Celestes, and how that led me to so much more. I'd end up reading and watching videos for hours that would ultimately lead to a brand new curiosity around the assassination of an American president in 1963. Now, clearly, this was a pivotal moment in American history. An event that would touch generations, and most fascinating, the version of events that would be cemented in history almost immediately, before an investigation had even taken place. How recorded telephone conversations between the newly sworn-in president, LBJ, and the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, within hours of the tragic event, would document that the two men had decided on what had taken place, and the message to the American public would be simple. It would be straightforward, and it would not be deviated from. Period. One guy, one bullet, no conspiracy. And then, how a commission would be appointed and an investigation would be conducted, and that Warren Commission would quickly produce a report that solidified what had happened, right along in concert with the head of the FBI and the President of the United States. And that version, at that point, was set in concrete. A piece of American history that today has museums that further perpetuate that version of American history. In other words, what we're all told and taught. I mean, if you're a kid in junior high and your school takes a field trip to any one of those museums, you'll learn that single version of American history. But if you're a guy like me that never went on a field trip to one of those museums, well, you didn't really learn any version of it. At least I didn't. That story of a lone renegade, a communist sympathizer that acted alone, a guy named Lee Harvey Oswald, the guy that fired 3 shots, and it was one of those 3 shots that would kill our president. And then, a few days later, another renegade, a guy named Jack Ruby, a ticked-off businessman that had decided to take justice into his own hands, and in turn, assassinate Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, Ruby would be convicted of murder, but that case would be overturned, and while awaiting retrial, Ruby would die of cancer. Case closed. The president, dead. The guy that killed the president, dead. The guy that killed the guy that killed the president, dead. Easy, clean, simple, right? Case closed. But dig a little deeper, read and watch a little more, and all these years later it becomes relatively clear, and in some cases evidence-based, that things weren't so clean, so simple. I mean, is life ever really that simple? Maybe. And in this case, probably. But maybe not. Perhaps even a conspiracy. And then when one watches a video outlining in detail how the country's very own Central Intelligence Agency could have been behind the assassination of our president? Well, I just gotta let that sink in for a moment. Our government killed our president? That's what some out there would have me believe. So it's easy, so easy, to get sucked into hours of reading, watching, listening, absorbing, all to land on, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't there. Heck, I wasn't even born. I did go on to read that most of the conspiracies have been debunked using today's science, but there are still many unanswered questions. And the implications are huge and have their tentacles buried deep into the fabric of American society to this day. I mean, could have events just like these have set the course or perhaps just been one more step in landing us where we are today? 2020 America. We're coming on 244 years of the greatest democratic experiment in the history of the world, and in the middle of a presidential race, on one side of which, a failed businessman, a man that after being given millions by his father would file bankruptcy 6 times, but then use a television show to create the image of a successful businessman. A man married 3 times, not faithful to a single one of his wives, a pathological liar, and a man accused by more than a dozen women of attempting to sexually assault them. And yet, some 60 million Americans are geared up and ready to vote for him. Again. As if the 4-year shite show we're coming off of had never happened. And just for the record, I'm not one of those 60 million. And on the other ticket? Well, a not-so-squeaky clean guy himself. A career politician that plays himself off as a good old Joe, just a guy next door that espouses to relate to the life of the working man, while he's never really lived a day in that life. And the fact is, he's part of the institution that some out there would have me believe is capable of killing its own. Ay, ay, ay. And yet, here we are. Those are my choices. And one more time, Democratic and the Republican parties have placed the American voter in a situation in which we are compelled to pick the lesser of 2 evils. It's seriously insanity, but it's our reality. I guess I could do an entire podcast series on this topic alone, and its apparent existence in perpetuity in our lives. But why bother? It's been done 1,000,000 times, and the insanity continues. So for now, my takeaway remains the same. Educate myself. Ask questions and learn. Stay curious. Don't dismiss the uncomfortable. Engage with folks that might think differently or hold a different belief. So maybe just be human and see each other as human. And work together to pick the facts, to learn, and to do better. And with all this rolling around in my head, we rolled into a place called Fort Stockton. And I wondered what this place had to teach me. Turns out, a lot. An area even further into the middle of nowhere. We're now just over 200 miles away from El Paso and over 300 miles away from San Antonio. So why do some 8,000 Texans call Fort Stockton home? Well, let's start at the beginning. The area in general became popular among Native Americans thousands of years prior to any attempt at settlement by Spanish or European settlers. The presence of the Comanche Springs combined with the nearby Pecos River meant a more than abundant and reliable water source in the region that would help to sustain strong agricultural activity. As we moved deeper into the region, I'd also recognize that we were driving deeper into the ancestral heritage of the Apache and the Comanche people. And curious to understand more about these people, I'd first learned that their names themselves came with deep historical roots. The name Apache appears to have a couple different potential origins, both deep in the culture of the people. Some believe that the name is of Yavape origin and is an interpretation of the word Apache, which simply means people, and could also establish ties between the tribes that stretched all across the region, all the way back through what is today Arizona. Others have established possible connections with the Zuni people, a tribe that primarily inhabited regions of what is now New Mexico. And within this culture, it is believed that the word Apache is derived from the Zuni word Apachu, which means enemy. Very different from simply meaning people, but could explain the conflicts across the region between tribes that date back nearly 4,000 years. And the word, or the name, Comanche? Well, that's a name with much simpler and direct ties to the Ute word, Kimansi, which translates to anyone who wants to fight me all the time, which is a clear reference to the Comanches' reputation as fierce warriors. More on that in a minute. But regardless of origin, these names highlight the perspectives and interactions between different Native American tribes and their neighbors, long before Spanish, European, and eventually American settlers would arrive in the area. And fast forward to around 1859, when Fort Stockton was established as Camp Stockton by the U.S. Army to protect travelers and settlers from the Native American raids along the San Antonio to El Paso Road. The fort was named after Robert Field Stockton, a notable U.S. Navy Commodore and military leader. The fort's strategic location near those Comanche Springs would quickly establish the fort and the safe passage through the area as essential. And during the Civil War, the fort would be abandoned by the Union forces and briefly occupied by Confederate troops. But soon after the Civil War and the Confederacy's loss, the fort would be reestablished and resume its mission of providing safety for settlers passing through and settling throughout the region. In reading through this part of the fort's history, that's when I learned of the Buffalo Soldiers. And here was just one more example of a piece of American history that had somehow gotten past me. A movie was made about them in 1997 telling their story, and the internet and YouTube is full of documentaries. And yet this is the first time that I had read of a piece of American history so laden with irony that it's nearly inconceivable. The story begins in 1866 when Congress passed the Army Organization Act. The act would have many elements, and among them, the creation of 6 all-black cavalry and infantry regiments, which would later be consolidated into 4. Fresh off the Civil War, the nation may have just fought a war to end slavery, but segregation would remain alive and well for decades in every element of American society, including within the military. And likely one of the first ironies in the story would be the fact that black soldiers that had fought and risked their lives for their freedom from slavery did so while being segregated from the white soldiers they fought alongside during the Civil War. And the ones that chose to remain in the military would be shifted to regiments like the Buffalo Soldiers, where segregation would remain. At the time, many young black men that had been born into slavery now found themselves with few options when it came to being accepted, finding a job, and making a living. They viewed joining the military as an opportunity to create stability, opportunity, and a future for themselves and their families, and maybe even finally, acceptance. But the irony continues, because these regiments would end up being utilized by the U.S. military in jobs that were basically considered the crap jobs. But regardless of whether the work was appreciated or not, these men would take their work and their responsibility seriously. Very seriously. Whether it was firefighting and policing the national forests, which included capturing cattle rustlers and removing cattle that were illegally grazing on public lands, they'd also become an integral part in building the beginnings of an infrastructure in the national parks, which would go on to become the roadways, trails, museums, and most everything we enjoy in our national parks to this day. But another critical task they would be assigned would be controlling and combating Native Americans across the West, with their primary responsibility being protecting the American settlers, those folks chasing their dreams into that American West. The work of the Buffalo Soldiers that were assigned to Fort Stockton would not only risk their lives protecting these settlers, but would continue their contribution to the nation's infrastructure by working on railway installations, protecting stagecoach and wagon trains into and out of the area. When learning of this period, that's when I came across, a couple of the nuttiest and most egregious ironies of all. These soldiers, on a daily basis, would find themselves fighting for, risking their lives for, white settlers, many of which hated them and still viewed them as slaves. It was not uncommon for Buffalo Soldiers to die at the hands of the very Americans they were tasked to protect. It's also well documented that they were treated substandard to white soldiers within the military, oftentimes being shorted on rations and being forced to make do with what they had, while white infantry units received everything they needed and more. And since black soldiers were not allowed to become officers at the time, the white officers they reported to would often abuse and mistreat these men themselves, using them as scapegoats and falsely accusing them of crimes. And finally, maybe the greatest irony in it all, their name, the Buffalo Soldiers, a name bestowed upon them by the Native Americans they were sent to combat. After initial interaction with these brave soldiers, the Native Americans they fought against would coin the phrase Buffalo Soldiers. And it's believed this was done to recognize their fierce fighting skills. And given that the Native American culture revered the great American buffalo as a symbol of strength and majesty, the Buffalo Soldiers would begin to wear the brand with honor, and began incorporating it into their uniform and badging. It would seem that even the humans these soldiers were sent to fight against would bestow a greater honor, reverence, and respect upon them than the folks they were sent to protect, and even the military they served. And yet, in the face of all this, some 20,000 to 30,000 brave soldiers would take their place in history, unrecognized, but a crucial element in a turbulent period of American history, ensuring the security of the area, thus allowing the U.S. Southwest to become what we know today. It would not be until 1948, well after these brave men had gone on to contribute to American victories in 2 world wars, that President Truman would sign the act that desegregated the American military. I watched the 1997 movie Buffalo Soldier, and several other documentaries centered on the lives of these amazing men, and one woman, Cathay Williams, a black woman that would masquerade successfully for 2 years as a male Buffalo Soldier. Seriously, there's some pretty amazing stuff out there when it comes to the human spirit in American history. It's also pretty amazing how much of this has gone unrecognized. I mean, for real, why hasn't Hollywood made a movie about Cathay Williams? Maybe I don't even want to know. But I am grateful to learn of her, and others, and have the opportunity to appreciate them. I also watched another documentary, the title, I Was a Buffalo Soldier, the story of Nolan Self. I'm well aware that I could never, ever fully understand the experience of one of these men. But when I listened to a 96-year-old Nolan Self tell me, as he recounted his return from Europe at the close of World War II, and I'm quoting, I went in as everybody does, a buck sergeant. But I knew my background. I knew I wasn't a smart boy. I knew I was a poor boy. I knew I was a black boy. But I felt things would be different when I came back, because I fought in 5 campaigns. I came out when the war was over, and I had some good things happen to me, and I was able, somehow, to become a first sergeant. End quote. Listening to Nolan tell me of his wonderment in becoming a first sergeant after the war, recognizing it as the highest rank, black or white, and not fully, really, understanding how he could get there, how he could achieve that. After all he had done, all he had risked and sacrificed, for a country that wasn't quite as grateful for him as he was for it. But Nolan did it. He survived it. He was part of something that few of us even know existed, and was surprised and grateful to be recognized and rewarded. And maybe simply because just a few years prior, he'd been a cotton plantation worker, and grateful for that, grateful for a roof over his head and a meal. He and so many others, they took another path, the path of the U.S. military, and sought a different future, and were grateful, coming out the other side of it all with something, maybe little more than a roof over his head and recognition. But one of Nolan's favorite quotes is, "I might only get paid $1, but that's $1 I didn't have." Nolan also goes on to talk about the days after his service in the military, when he suddenly found himself, yet again, not really accepted anywhere, unable to find work. Finally, out of desperation and the need to feed his growing family, he found himself working on the back of a garbage truck. And when he wanted to quit that job, it would be his wife that would encourage him. "What else you gonna do, Nolan? Keep at it. God has a plan for everyone," she'd tell him. And Nolan did keep at it. And just a year later, he'd be called to the office and promoted to the superintendent position, overseeing the operations citywide, a job he would work hard at for 17 years until he retired. And yet again, I've stumbled onto a piece of this America's history that a 50-year-old white guy didn't know a thing about. A 50-year-old white guy that maybe wouldn't even be here if it weren't for guys like Nolan out there. And then there was that one more click, and read a little more. And I'd learn of other little-known facts of this era and this part of the universe. For me, these discoveries would come in the form of a video titled History of the Indian Wars, a full documentary, published by the YouTube channel The Mysterious World. I'd learn of a place called Comancheria, a vast territory controlled by the Comanche people during the 18th and 19th centuries. This region spanned parts of present-day New Mexico, West Texas, southeastern Colorado, southwestern Kansas, western Oklahoma, and even into Mexico. The boundaries of Comancheria would at times be fluid, but nonetheless remained fully in control of a fierce and barbaric fighting force, the Comanche. Those Comanche would become known as the best horse breeders anywhere. They had the largest pony herds and were widely considered to be the most skilled horsemen ever known. Comanche warriors were known for their ability to ride at full gallop, shooting multiple arrows using the horse's neck as a shield. And many things differentiated the Comanche from other tribes. They had no rigid form of government or system that ruled their actions. They lived in tight bands throughout the region with no centralized group of elders. Leaders within certain bands sometimes changed often based on skill. They were not really interested in peace or seeking it. They believed the land was theirs, and if anyone attempted encroachment, should and would pay with their life. In other words, leave them alone. But therein lies some interesting dichotomies within their cultures. Yes, they love to fight. In fact, they lived for it. It's kind of even in their name. Every member of this society was taught from a young age how to fight. It is said that any Comanche could lead warriors into war. The most generous with spoils of war, and the most wins would be followed by others. A warrior's greatest honor was in counting coup, which is the art of touching an enemy in battle without killing them, and the most horses stolen for the tribe or band. That kinda leads one to believe that their primary objective in going to battle was more of a keeping score thing rather than to kill. But make no mistake, they would kill when needed. And for nearly 150 years, the Comanche would successfully fight off and in some cases destroy the other Native American tribes in the region, but they'd also fend off Spanish conquistadors, the Mexican army, the Texan army, even the American army, to protect and retain their cherished nation and homeland. And if you need a sense of how feared these warriors were, the common belief at the time amongst any in the area was that if you went into battle with the Comanche and lost, your best hope was that you died in battle, because surviving the battle and being taken hostage most certainly meant a fate much worse than death. Read on, and you'll learn that male captives could expect anything from scalping and disemboweling to being tied to a wagon wheel and roasted alive over an open fire. And female captives? Well, it's well documented that they had it much worse, because their torture and rape went on for the life of their captivity, and if they were lucky, they'd eventually be traded back to the enemy for a few horses. And it's right about here that history throws in yet one more not very well-known twist. And that is that were it not for the Comanche, with their now allies, the Kiowa Indians, preventing Spain from establishing a more solid footing in the Texas region of Comancheria, the map of the U.S. would likely look a lot different than it does today, because history now tells us that the success of the Comanche in preventing Spain from solidifying their Mexican empire would ultimately lead to their undoing by setting things up for a new enemy, the United States of America. Once Texas had declared sovereignty from Mexico, the area would continue to see an influx in American settlers. The sheer volume of settlement in the area began to shift power. Initially, these settlers themselves simply provided more targets for the Comanche and Kiowa, more opportunity to steal horses, and hostages that could either be bargained for more horses or killed. But the Comanche would quickly learn that this new breed of American settler would come with a different set of tactics and a sense of veracity that they had not encountered amongst their other enemies in the region. For example, when attempting to attack a settlement of this new breed of American, they were surprised to learn that everyone in the settlement was shooting at them, even the children, something that they had never seen before, a child with a gun engaging in warfare to save their life. And then, two more things happened: the Texas Rangers and the Colt revolver. See, until this point, the one thing the Comanche had over any of their enemies was their skill on a horse. Settlers couldn't fight at that level. So, Texans, well, they did what Texans do. They had a problem. Their settlers were being attacked by Native Americans, and being a newly formed sovereign nation, they had no access to the forces of the U.S. cavalry, and what military forces they did possess were struggling to push back these Native American advances. So, they created a force that could. They'd call these cowboys and veterans of the Civil War and any other volunteer brave enough to sign up the Texas Rangers. and a new breed of law enforcement, prairie policing, was born. The Rangers would quickly grow, organize, and evolve. Typically they worked in small groups of 8 to 10 men, but unencumbered by the weight of full military gear, these men had quickly proven that with not much more than a rifle, a pistol, a knife, and a bedroll, could move across the Texas plains with the same agility as their Comanche enemy. They'd also quickly become adept at hunting them down and striking proactively, as opposed to reacting to an attack. Now throw in the Colt revolver, and Texas now had an agile and responsive force that would not hesitate to engage in battle with an enemy tenfold higher in number, and win. Their repeating revolvers enabled them to offer gunfire far outmatching the bow and arrow that just a few years prior had been the superior weapon when compared to a muzzle-loading rifle. The tables had turned. And it certainly wasn't easy, and there are plenty more twists and turns in this story. You'll also read of how the Texas Rangers, that ragtag renegade group of saviors that had quickly become the heroes of the Texas settlement era, were also a group of lawless men, by design, that would often take matters into their own hands, for sometimes the wrong reasons, and do things none of us would be proud of. Maybe probably expected, I guess, when you hand a 20-year-old a gun and a horse and tell him to go kill bad people. But only bad people. Oh, and you're the judge and the jury. Now, needless to say, the Texas Rangers have evolved over the years, even being dismantled a time or two through Texas history. But today, they're alive and well, and function as a part of the Texas Department of Safety. You'll find them helping in everything from working cold cases to assisting with border security, criminal investigations, and more. That's a lot of history. All because we wandered into a place called Fort Stockton, wandered around a bit, snapping photos, and wondering how very different it would have felt some 160 years ago. A place that started with the name St. Gall, but would later rename itself in honor of the fort that literally allowed the existence of a town in America's Wild West. Not just to make it through the Wild West, but to grow, thrive even. The military would cease operation of the fort in 1886, but today the fort's listed on the National Historic Registry and is maintained by the city of Fort Stockton. Now, things seemed pretty quiet when we went through, but I think that can be chalked up to timing. Come through here in March, and you can check out the Comanche Springs Rodeo, when thousands of professional rodeo athletes and their fans stop in for a turn at team roping, bareback bronco and bull riding, saddle bronc riding, and lots more. Or the following month, when each April welcomes the Big Bend Open Road Race, an event held annually on U.S. Highway 285 between Fort Stockton and Sanderson, Texas. Known as the most challenging open road race in the world, it attracts drivers from all over who compete in a high-speed race along a 118-mile round-trip course. Now, the race itself is the center point of the annual event, but you can also participate in technical inspections, rookie driving schools, car shows, even a parade, all leading up to race day. The event's capped off with the winner's banquet. And not to be outdone by any other city in the nation, Fort Stockton brings its own touch to a 2-day 4th of July celebration. It includes car shows, live music, dancing, open-air vendors, and all the food and crafts that you could possibly imagine. And just in case goat roping is on your bucket list, you can do a bit of that during this celebration as well. And, of course, they cap things off with a fireworks display. The city takes a bit of a break during the rest of the hot summer, but picks up the party fun again each October for the Fall Festival. And yet again, an opportunity for the community to get together, welcome others, and enjoy live music, food, craft vendors, petting zoos, a cornhole tournament, and a truly Texas-style car show in which lifted trucks, lowriders, and hot rods are featured. But of course, it's not all fun and games here in Fort Stockton. The town is part of the Permian Basin, one of the largest oil and natural gas producing regions in the U.S. In addition, the town has embraced renewable energy projects including wind and solar farms. So keeping the power grids fired up is also a big part of what Fort Stockton is today. And my guess is, if you're anywhere in small-town Texas, ranching and agriculture are also along for the ride. Man, just some 300 miles or so into this place called Texas, and I've learned so much. Studying the map this morning over coffee, it's hard to decide. So much Texas. Above us, below us, in front of us. But for some reason, I feel like south. South is where we want to go. More Texas. And more of those border towns. Maybe somewhere around that place called Del Rio. I wonder what we'll learn there.
Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few. Because you can. No, seriously. You can.